but there's a hiddenness to it. Because,
and I'm calling that a need in God, but maybe you don't want to call it that.
Yeah,
I mean, why doesn't God just dismiss the adversary and just say, yeah, but you're wrong, man. Let's move on.
Go kick rocks.
Yeah, exactly. Why doesn't that happen? The thing about it for me, and I, way back when I first talked to Paul the very first time, I think I tried to express this, and it's part of kind of the thing that's important to me, is that, these things are not really, and we talk about this in kind of logical terms about the distinction between the propositional and the non-propositional and all that stuff. That's all a bunch of conversation and all a bunch of talk and thinking. But at the base of it, for me, is this real embodied experience of things that way back into my youth is the reason that I've kind of engaged with literature, history, and ideas. It's nothing other than the fact that at those moments where it really hits you or it really makes you feel the reality of what's being talked about. That's what really draws me back to it and draws me in to try to find another version of that expression that will, kind of bring that feeling alive in the reading of it or in the experiencing of it. And that's a very different thing than just kind of figuring out some way of describing what the message is of the work. Here we're talking about Job. And I really appreciate it. I know it's a little bit of a thing with you, but it really is touching to me that you can read those lines and you kind of break down a little bit. And I don't consider that to be a flaw in any way. That's exactly what it does for me. And if it's not doing that, then it's not embodied. It's not real. It's not expressing the truth.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Sometimes, like I said, I feel like a crazy person, but I keep getting positive feedback. So
yeah. Well, that's good. That's good. That's the way it should be. Yeah. I have all sorts of ideas. I don't know where this will go. You and Sherry were able to spend so much time on it, which I think was so good because it really deserves that. That's one of the flaws in almost all the other ways that I've heard this talked about, is that people try to jam in some sort of way of talking about it in 1 hour or something. And that's just completely inadequate to what's going on there. And so the fact that you guys were able to spend so much time was really part of what was needed, Don't you think that's right?
And it was a personal need for me because before I went through it with Sherry, and shout out to Sherry because Sherry is a total example of that embodied sort of wisdom and knowledge, because she has her homestead. She works with animals and horses and has chickens and sheep and raised a family and as well as just deal with the elements of being out in rural Vancouver. And she always sort of took that intuition in herself seriously enough to follow it and pay attention to it and ruminate on it. So I would do all this, we kind of joked about this, but I would just do all this prep. I would read so-and-so and read this essay and read that, go through the chapter, highlight specific things that I'd like to talk about. And she would just show up and then we'd go through it and I would have enough to keep us going. And then she'd just be spouting off these.
Yeah. The other reason I got in touch with you, and I tried to get in touch with you, didn't know how to quite do it until Ted and I were communicating. Then I saw him on your channel, but I tried to get you through the Discord or whatever, because one of the reasons was how envious I was of that relationship that you and Sherry had built, to be able to talk in such, free ways and kind of, let things go a little bit, but at the same time, never really lose the thread and the important message. So you're blessed to be able to have that relationship.
Yeah, she was a perfect conversation partner. And going into it, I wanted to go through the whole book with someone, but I actually had done it before with a Bible study at my church. So it was a men's Bible study, and there's one guy leading it, and he was going to be taking like some time off. He like approached me. He's like, "Hey, do you want to try to lead something for a bit? Would you mind?" Like, and I mentioned to him, I was like, "I just want to go through the book of Job." He's like, "Really?" I was like, "Yeah, I do," because like kind of like I'd had all these great insights that I got because basically Jordan Peterson sort of taught me about the ancient sort of order chaos framework that the ancient world kind of had their cosmology based in. And so that kind of unlocked a ton of stuff for me, because the question for me was always like, why is Leviathan in God's speech? Why is it at the end of God's speech? And why does it take up a quarter of God's speech? And so that was like and so when that
like perplexing to you for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. And when that clicked for me, I was like, okay, this is like a creation story. At first I was like, okay, God's speech is about creation. And then I was like, oh, then I'm like, oh, the whole book is about creation. But anyway, so like I kind of read the first part of Job and I read the last part, God's speech, and there's all this middle part. And I'm just like, what do I do with all these speeches with all the friends and all of Job and the insane things that get said in there?
Yeah.
Because you kind of get told by the writer, you're like, Job is a righteous man at the beginning, and you get told at the end that God says, Job, you speak what's right. And then in the middle, Job is like saying, I loathe my life. I wish you would just crush me. God fills me with arrows. I drink his poison. Totally. And I'm like,
how do we put it together?
In the Bible. Why isn't anyone talking about it? And so I wanted to go through that whole middle part with people. So long story short, I went through it with the guys' Bible study. It went over kind of well, but most people were kind of like, to one guy was super unhappy. Like one guy especially. He's my good friend. Like he hated it. He's like, this is like some sort of mistake that this book got in the Bible. Like there's all kinds of errors probably.
Not the first one to say that, I think.
No, not at all. No. And so, but then I was able to go through it with Sherry in a little bit more this little corner way where it was a better conversation about it for sure.
Yeah. And the other thing about it, and this is a hard thing about it, is, your idea of the intermediary and the way in which the last scene, kind of structures that intermediary role, or that cosmos with Job as the intermediary. That's an idea that I just said that, and you understand what I'm talking about, but there's a lot to unpack to get to the point where you can see that as, the kind of the place that this thing lands. Mm-hmm. And it just shows you the kind of richness of this work. And it also is a perplexing thing, because it's like, well, how is it that someone is really supposed to get to there if they're not, if they don't have the stamina, to do all this stuff. Right. But it's the stuff that I love about literature, is that kind of interlacing and the intertextuality, the way it's referring to other things. And that's exactly what in literature, or certainly the Bible and the world of the text of the Bible, is so rich that way. You're bringing in Psalm 104, and I mean that's just where it's all at for me, and
for me too.
See that and feel that is just so, that's very important to me. And I don't know how to explain that. Here we are talking about this. Someone else might listen to it. And it's like, what in the heck are they saying?
I know, right? Yeah, that's the whole thing. Is like, how do you get? Like, I always ask this question when I'm talking with people. We always get to this point where I'm like, how do you get people to see? How do you get people to see? My friend who is in the Bible study, I'm basically talking about the same sort of stuff, and I'll spell something out. I'm like, isn't that incredible? And they're like, no, this is terrible. Like, what are you talking about? This is awful. Like this vision of like whatever you just said was, I like, how do you get someone to see? And I finally just sort of came, like, I'm kind of at the point where like, I don't know.
Right.
Like I basically can just,
you have the sensibility and the kind of desire or drive to try to work that stuff out, or you don't, and then you need a mentor, you need an example or a way to look at someone else working it through and see that you can get there. And that's kind of what I saw with your videos, and I really appreciate that.
Well, thanks.
What else would we, I wondered what we might talk about. I might give you the opportunity to say some things. I have a few ideas that even go to quirky directions about it.
I have a list of things too, so we can just start.
All right. Well, why don't you start, and then I'll throw one out after that.
Well, I just want to ask, because you said that in the email you sent me, you're like, you kind of reframed the book of Job for me. And I just wanted to ask you, like, how did you see it before? And like, you mentioned a little bit how you see it now, but like what? Well,
it really was that I was, I did study it pretty in depth. I don't know if you remember hearing me tell this story to Paul, but there was a point about 7 or 8 years ago where I really did maybe it was even longer than that now, but where I did a kind of concentrated, really what for me was an in-depth kind of biblical kind of experience, where I just started at the beginning and wouldn't move to the next book until I really felt like I'd gotten a fuller and deeper understanding of where, what that text was about. I don't know that that's the only way or even the best way to go through the Bible. Right. But anyway, that was what I did. And I read Job, and I had read Job when I was younger, probably even multiple times. But I think I was susceptible to the traditional way that people talk about it, both kind of officially as here's what it's about, and unofficially, because people don't say this, but they all feel it, that it sucks and it's long and it's boring in the middle. I mean, I even see people who are trying to exegete it in a positive sense say that the middle is boring, and and I kind of allowed a little of that to influence me. And then when you started talking about it as poetry, which of course I knew it was poetry, but as poetry in the way that I find poetry important, and then the wisdom poem in the center, just struck me, powerfully. And then I realized, oh, this is what this thing's about. It's about the poetry. And that for me, it's really importantly about what I think is different about poetry than prose, or what I think is different about, some sort of affective, emotionally driven, or the point being to evoke a direct experience of emotion as opposed to make some sort of argument. And once I noticed that, I realized, oh, that just opened the whole thing up for me and made me, which I probably should have been able to figure out before, but I didn't. And so whatever it was, you threw the pebble in the pond, and it, just opened up for me at that point.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like I find, like, every time I like realize something, I'm like, oh, I should have seen that before. Like, it's so obvious. like when I was like, oh, God's speech is about creation, and then you look back through it and you're like, he's literally just talking. That's all he's talking about.
Yeah, it's just like, it's so obvious.
Like, but like you said, you kind of get stuck where someone, I don't know why, but it was like, just for an example, you just think God's speech is there just to bully Job and show off his strength and his power.
Or it's just there, and maybe it was just patched together and it really doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Maybe because he stops speaking, and then Job starts speaking. It's like he just stops,
Yeah.
So there's sense that you could look at it as, well, it's just not very well written. I don't mean that, but what I mean is you can feel that if you're not, tuned into it.
Yeah. Yeah. And people, like, even like, I've listened to so many people lecture on Job and these PhDs and stuff, and they'll just be like, yeah, this section, we think it's just totally wrong. And like, how do you know? And they're like, well, we know because and there is stuff that's a little like you can't
quirky. There's some quirkiness in there.
There's quirkiness in there. But I'm like, you're just like, yeah, this part was supposed to be over here, and this gets rearranged over here, and this makes more sense. And I was actually went through like, I can't remember his name. I've got his guide, his Bible study guide, but he was like a Southern Baptist Reformed guy.
Yep.
And he had a series from a university class he was teaching. It was like a semester long thing where they just did Job. and it was so good. But he was just like, from the very beginning, he's like, there's all these arguments. We may mention some of them along the way, but we'll just take the book as it is, whole, as it's written. And he knew Hebrew and all that, so he wasn't just like, he wasn't.
I might want to have that reference. That kind of stuff.
Let me grab the book. It's right here. He wrote the guide for this publisher, but what's the guy? Dwayne A. Garrett.
Okay.
Dwayne, Duane, Garrett, Garrett. And so Dr. Garrett is like he I forget what seminary he's at, but I think it's even a Calvinist or Reformed seminary.
That kind of interests me a little bit too, because the Reformed interpretations that I've bumped into, sometimes I wonder whether they're the ones that I resonate the most with. But
oh, really?
Yeah. Well, we get to the one thought I had was to go to these global questions that everyone seems to ask about it and just talk globally about the text. And you and Sherry seem to come down on a side that would go against what at least I thought I saw the Reformed guys saying, and that is Job culpable, or is Job wrong? Is Job doing something wrong here, despite what God says in the end? Or is there a lesson that he's needing to learn, let's say, despite the he's righteous comment at the beginning, et cetera? I see a lot of people outlining a kind of position on it that really it's the case that he is actually, if you will, wrong. And that doesn't necessarily mean the suffering is justified, but the suffering is purgative, or it's transformative with a core element of Job not seeing the world correctly, or not. And what do you think about that? Because I thought you and Sherry were kind of not gravitating towards that notion.
Well, I don't think it's people think as soon as you say Job did something wrong, then everything can be justified, because then you get in. Like,
exactly.
You can find a way to get there, because you can just, you've probably heard the line, a sin against an infinite God is infinitely transgressive, or I don't know, something like that. Right. Yeah. And so just the smallest thing, like God is well within his rights to do whatever it is to punish you. And I think that's just corrosive to, not only just the interpretation of it, because then you're just like, oh, that's just what it's about. It's just about a guy that screwed up and God just smashing him. And
right.
And there's something to be said about that. But I think Job gets set up in such a way that, like, you have these sort of bumpers that you're not allowed. Like, if you take him seriously, that's what makes the whole book interesting for me.
I think that's
when you say that Job is righteous, and then God at the end says Job did speak correctly, then what the heck is going on here? Because it looks like the opposite. And so this is sort of the.
Yeah. And then, so I agree with that. And there's a couple of versions of conversations about this. I don't know if you know who David Bonavec is, but he's got one that's like this, and I like him, and he's gentle with the text. He's not like, he's not like saying something malign about the text, but he does, I think he does end up with something like that. So it's not an unusual thing to try to do.
No,
that he doesn't submit himself, that Job doesn't submit himself to his lack of knowledge. In other words, he doesn't take seriously the fact that he doesn't know God's ways. And if he admitted that, it was prideful of him, I think is the way that most people say it. It's prideful of him to keep asking for this response from God, and that in the end, that's what he learns, and that pride sounds like a sin to me, and then that's the explanation. I don't actually agree with that, but I'm just saying that there's a lot of people out there who not insignificant people, let's say.
No, like I was just
outline it that way.
Or not just listening, but I listened a while ago to John Piper preached a 2 sermon series on Job. And so like the first sermon, like I don't know. I don't like John Piper's preaching. Like it does, like, first of all, it does nothing for me. And like, I know people that really like him, and I don't hold it against them, but like the first sermon he gave was pretty good. And it was about, like, when someone is suffering, how do you approach them? Like the friends are doing everything wrong. And that was, and he builds up Job as a righteous man, and that this is a test and a trial. And I'm going along with him. And I'm like, not bad, Piper, not bad. And then he gets into the second sermon, and then he's like, and this guy Elihu comes along and he's right. And I'm just like, what? And so like, there's this weird thing about the book, and it's because at the end, God condemns the 3 friends. So Eliphaz, Bildad.
Right. He doesn't condemn. I've heard this.
He doesn't condemn specifically Elihu.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And Elihu is like this strange character, and even
presence in the book.
Yeah. He's like, his name is similar to Elijah, and Elijah is the one that prepares the way for the Lord. And there's this whole buildup in the last like chapter of Elihu's speech where all he is talking about is the coming storm. He can see it coming on the horizon, and here comes God, and isn't he glorious and great? And so there's this quite dramatic thing about Elihu, but like, there's one reason why I like Dr. Dwayne Garrett is because he made the argument. He's like, Elihu doesn't say anything different than the other friends. Yeah. And so people like to think that Elihu is saying something like I've heard it said, like the other friends will make the argument like, Job, you must have done something wrong, or you must be doing something wrong, or there must be something secret in your heart. And then they'll say like, Elihu makes the argument like, God is keeping you from future sin. Like that's why he's doing it. And I'm just like, I don't see it in the text, but then I'm also like, the whole like, we get so caught up with the sin stuff, like who's getting punished, like this tit for tat kind of thing. And I'm like, that's what all the friends are doing.
That's what the whole book is about.
That was the point. And then Job was the one that was saying like, no, take me seriously. I'm innocent.
Right.
I need an answer from God. And then, for people,
well, I think, don't you think some of this comes from trying to read Paul, let's say, in Original Sin back into the text and try to preserve this kind of cosmology that is important in the New Testament, of course. And so I'm not trying to undermine that, but trying to read that back into this text and kind of, if you will, save it or say it has to also apply here. And that's what I feel like people have the need to kind of do.
I think that's probably a main component. And so, but I feel like those little bumpers that are set up in Job are so like plain to see that I'm like, just keep within the bounds. Like, stop trying to be like, oh, original sin, or oh, this.
All right. So there's my dog barking.
I think the book is actually trying to set up a case where the opposite setup is true. So the opposite, meaning like the righteous man gets punished, or suffers. Then Job makes the argument that the wicked are actually prospering.
Right.
And then what does God say about that? And well, that to me is like, I mean, that that's why the book is interesting, because I feel like it's because it like sits there right next to, right near Proverbs, and basically the friends are speaking Proverbs and stuff, and so, what does God have to say about this? And the idea that it would be, people will say like, oh, Job must have done something wrong. That's the only reason why. And then my question to them would be just sort of like, why doesn't God say that then? And Job repents at the end, but and the question is like, what is he repenting of?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. And you can like, come up with a few things there, but
yeah, like people will say like Job was prideful and that he didn't realize God was so great. And you can literally go into the speeches where Job just says, God is great. What can I do? Like whatever he wants to do, he can do. He's stronger.
I got with
more powerful, Job already understood these things. This isn't like a new revelation that God is mighty or
it's 42:6, I think it is. I got with Jacob, actually. I sent an email to Jacob and got him to try to translate that for me because that word repent is so powerful in the sense of intertextuality that we've just been talking about. And I kind of favor, and this is just my bias, I'm throwing it out as my bias, but I favor a sense that it isn't. I think you can translate that something like I am comforted in the dust and ashes, or I kind of something like I rest in the dust and ashes, or I fall down in the dust and ashes, or something like that, rather than I repent in the dust and ashes. And I don't know, how do you feel about that? Because that's where that moment is, and it's kind of obviously important.
Well, I kind of see it as I take it as an honest repentance, and I take it as a sinless repentance. In the same way as when you go from childhood to adulthood, you at some point you repent of your childish ways. Mm-hmm. Like it's no longer appropriate to act like a child. And it usually is like you're just growing up. Like
his crying out, his exhortation is in some sense something he realizes now he wouldn't continue to do, or he wouldn't do. Is that?
Yeah, because he says right before that, he says, I have heard of you.
Right. But now I see you.
But now I see you. Yeah. And so there's some sort of greater thing that he understands now. And the greater thing he understands that Job says is, I can see that you can do all things. Then, people like to equate this with God just showing him his power. But I think Job didn't understand at first how God could allow this to happen to him in the injustice of it. And these things were this is what's always bugging Job, because now God in a way, he says this, he's like, there's like a veil, there's a cloud in front of my face. I can't discern God anymore because of the evil that he's done to me, the bad that he's brought into my life. But then how do I explain it? Like after God's speech, after God shows up and speaks to him, then he says, oh, I know you can do all things. Like this is reconciled somehow. And we part of the brilliance of the poem is we don't get a clean explanation why. It's not a systematic thing. It's all
right, let me throw this out to you, because this will maybe hopefully get me into this quirky interpretation that I have. Mm-hmm. What is starting in the very first scene? What is the problem? What is the problem? And I'll put it this way: who has the need in the beginning that needs to be resolved?
It's interesting.
I'll tell you what I think.
Well, like the way I see the beginning is a ripe fruit. Like it talks about Job's completeness. It talks about how wealthy he is, how full he is, how righteous he is, like a piece of ripe fruit.
So yeah, I see that for sure.
And so what happens to the fruit after it's ripe?
Well,
it falls from the tree.
Falls, yeah.
It hits the ground, it rots, it goes into the ground, then the seed sprouts, and then it grows.
Like I like that.
I think that's the story that's happening.
Yeah, I think that's true. Let me throw another line here.
There's no problem. Like everything's perfect. And so now's the time for the fruit to fall. It's just like.
Yeah, I can see that. And I don't think that's going to run counter to what I'm going to say here, but let me say it anyway. Yeah. The problem is that God has a need. God is lacking something at the beginning. And what he's lacking is the manifestation in the world. And now we're talking about Job here. In the world, the manifestation of authenticity of faith. So that's lacking. And that's understood in the conversation between him and the adversary. And that is to say, in a certain sense, God has to say, well, you're kind of right in the sense, not that Job is not righteous and only because of the reward, but that we haven't seen it. We don't see it.
Yep.
Because of the situation of the world at the time. And so the need then is in God to have, if you will, a creation or a cosmos that authentically expresses or manifests is the word I want to use, manifests the true faith or the true worship or the true relationship to God. And so what is ultimately developed in the end is that relationship, that authenticity of that relationship. So in the end, things look a lot the same. Now, I know your intermediary idea is very powerful and I really like it, but just putting it aside for the moment, in a certain sense, Job is exactly the same at the end as he was at the beginning. I mean, just in terms of kind of dramatic positions. And the last part of it is blind to any interiority of Job. So we don't really know some sort of spiritual growth, at least out of that last scene.
Mm-hmm.
We don't hear him say something, to his family or whatever about this depth and power of this experience or something. And so what really has happened in a way is that God has achieved this thing he needs. God needs this authenticity to be manifest. Mm-hmm. And that then goes to this idea of heaven and earth that Paul talks about, or that's all over the Bible, of course, and that we have a hint or a suggestion of the infinite, but all through there, we always realize that we don't know. God is vast, God is grand. We can't see through God's eyes, and that's a truth. But God can see all of that, but in a certain sense, here I'm going to get pretty crazy on you, okay?
All right, I'm ready.
In a certain sense, God is limited, and the thing that what God's limitation is that He can't see through Job's eyes. At the beginning, He can't have that limited view, if you will, and so I see here the fall and the eating of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And that's the burden that Job has, is that Job sees good and evil and he feels it, lives it, has a direct experience of it. And God, in a way, can't have that. So he has to make it happen in a certain way. He has to bring heaven down to earth and earth up to heaven. And in a certain way, it's this relationship that is in the end the fullness that is created, if you will, that we have a role and God has a role, if you will, in this. God is infinite, we are finite, but that finiteness has a certain kind of power. It's important to God that finiteness is there, and that we are the vehicle for that. And I don't know how that plays with you.
Yeah, well, Jung kind of goes down those lines. Have you read Jung's book
No,
on
I have
it?
not. I
He
tend to
almost
not
goes
be a
down
fan
that
of Jung
exact,
usually, but I
yeah,
don't
he
know. I
almost
haven't
goes,
tried very much.
he almost goes down that exact path. And
Yeah.
it's kind of the unity and multiplicity thing, or the
Right.
transcendent immanent stuff.
Yeah. That's where I'm going. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And so there's that inherent gap
Right.
between the two that's just there. Like there's no,
Right. I mean, you can't have transcendent unless it's transcendent.
Yeah, but they've got to touch somehow. So I don't see it as God lacking, but but that idea has appealed to me.
Or maybe it's the cosmos need, or if you will, the plan of God. The plan of God is to create this. Yeah.
Yeah. There's obviously something hidden. So with Satan's accusation, like it seems like everything's apparent in the very beginning.
Right.
Job's righteous. He's blessed. The way he serves God and worships God is correct. It just seems everything is like in order and straight. But
perhaps just to throw this in, perhaps there's a direct correlation between righteousness and reward and wickedness and punishment. Mm-hmm. In that world that Satan is running around back and forth looking around, what he sees is a direct correlation between
Satan
makes a fully just world, what you want to say, maybe.
Yeah, but he comes in and he's like, this is all corrupt. This appearance isn't real.
Mm-hmm.
This is what Satan is saying. He's like,
right.
So his accusation against Job is that if you got rid of all the stuff, like his heart wouldn't be towards you. And
that's the authenticity that I was reaching for a minute ago. Yeah.
Right. And then so the other accusation is implicitly towards God, is like, you're corrupt too, and you're doing this just for this worship stuff,
gratification, or
this ego or whatever,
status or ego, whatever. Yeah.
So that's the point of view of the accuser. Now God knows, in my view, God just knows that this isn't the case, but there's a hiddenness to it.
And I'm calling that a need in God, but maybe you don't want to call it that.
Yeah,
I mean, why doesn't God just dismiss the adversary and just say, yeah, but you're wrong, man. Let's move on.
Go kick rocks.
Yeah, exactly. Why doesn't that happen? Why do we need this?
Because God wants to reveal something. So this is like,
right. Make it manifest.
The apocalyptic nature of the book of Job.
That's
good. Revealing something, and there's this lovely quote.
Yeah, that's what I mean by manifest. It needs to be manifest.
It's exactly that. Yeah. And there's this lovely quote from some saint, I forget, but he said that God beat Job with a rod so that his fragrance may be spread more widely.
Yeah.
And I'm getting choked up. Whatever. There's this sort of tragedy about having to reveal something or there's at least this tragedy in here, that the revealing of Job as the righteous man involves him, sort of suffering all things. Like he suffers the most. And it's through that, like, you even see this in so like everyone is sort of like loves being in Job's world because they all have jobs to do and he pays well. But you get even the sense from the accusation of Satan as he's like going back and forth in the world. He's like, people could be like, yeah, it's probably corrupt and whatever. At least I'm getting a paycheck. And
right.
Stuff. And then so when Job is afflicted, he then complains later on. He's like, I used to be respected. I used to come down to the city gate and meet with the men, and they would respect me and all this stuff. And people treated me well. And he's not just lamenting the fact that he used to have status and now he doesn't. He's basically like, he's like, I really was, serving these people. They loved me, and all, this sort of perfect harmony, I imagine. And then he says, and now they sing songs about me and they make fun of me, and I'm a byword among them. They curse me. Men that I wouldn't even have put with my sheepdogs, their sons are saying these nasty things about me. So like everyone is like, yeah, we knew all along you were corrupt. And then after God's speech, and then all that stuff happens, it then says that everyone, so all his family, his brothers and sisters, and everyone that knew him before comes back to his household to eat bread with him and comfort him. And then they also give him a piece of gold and a ring. And this is right in line with, it says, and God restored Job. So that, like, everyone,
right, it's all that is important, that little section is before Job is restored. So the I think, isn't the sacrifice even before
sacrifice
Job
is before that,
before Job is restored. So you have to imagine him, in the ashes as the center of this gathering, if you will, this communal gathering. Yeah, I think that's very important. All right, here's another one.
But but there's this progression of being loved, being ridiculed, and then everyone comes to restore him. And why would they come to restore him if they thought he was still corrupt? It's because they actually realized that he was the righteous man that he was all along. Like the hiddenness of Job's righteousness that could have been like the accuser said he's corrupt, is now revealed as true righteousness.
Right. And that only can be in the world to gather around, to structure the world, to order the cosmos. That can only be there if it's manifested in this way. Yeah, that's a way of saying what I was trying to say a minute ago. I think that's exactly right.
I mean, I'm just basically agreeing with
your
own words.
Yeah, and that's you've had this in your head for maybe longer than I have, so you've got a good way of talking about that. So let's put another frame on it. And this is something from my kind of literary studies in the past. And that is that I think of this kind of like, kind of in a Platonic way, that not Platonic in the sense of Platonism, but rather the way I kind of think about Plato, and he kind of puts a world together, and we're kind of supposed to see all these components of the narrative that he puts together as elements in the whole, if you will. And so if you think of a soul that way, you can think of the narrative as building the consciousness congress, if you will, that Paul Vanderklay talks about, our or my consciousness congress. And in a certain way, I want to rehabilitate the questioners of Job, not necessarily rehabilitate them, but recognize them as a voice that's within me. Sure. You see someone who has a bad turn, and you recognize the markers of why they have that bad turn, whatever that happens to be, a bad habit or something you regard as, and maybe is a bad choice. And it's not that you necessarily say this out loud, but it's not very far from your tongue to say something like, well, this kind of thing that happens. Yeah. And that voice is part of us. It is a bad voice, but it is a part of us. And it needs, you kind of recognize it, you kind of feel it, and you should feel it as something that needs to be, you use the word, it needs to have an intermediary. It needs to be put in its place. It needs to be recognized as, in a certain sense, a necessary part of the whole thing, but at the center needs to be something else. You have to have in the middle some sort of genuine, real kind of recognition of our common humanity. And in order to have that, you got to have Job at the center. And he, I think I like the kind of notion of him putting his hand over his mouth at the end. In a sense, it's a quiet center that allows you to put at appropriate distance and recognition the weakness and essentially sin and ugliness of those other voices, which are really part of the way we actually navigate the day. We move forward by thinking of the world as, in a certain sense, just, or as being able to be a place we can navigate, being a place we can act in a certain way and expect a response, expect to get out of it what we put in a certain sense. And that is okay in a sense, as long as it's not, as long as it's not the whole, as long as it's not doing anything but, gathering around this central recognition of what kind of Job represents at the center. And it has to be that kind of sense that I think we all have about ourselves. I'm just babbling here now, but that, we are all sinners. And I think as Christians, we recognize that it's a fallen world and all of that. But when bad things happen, there's a central part of us that realizes that's a part of this world that really doesn't correlate with some responsibility that I bear. Mm-hmm. Even if it is the result of something I did, I am a weak individual and bad things happen. And it's some central sense that I have, it's not because of what I did. Mm-hmm. And that's a kind of center that in a certain sense is also kind of got a dangerous part to it, where you would lash out like Job does. But if held in the right proportion, if you will, if held in the right place, it's the center. Anyway, that's how I see this. And I didn't really get to this until I listened to you guys talk.
Well, there's a guy, an older guy in our men's Bible study, and just real quick, like, he's been kicked out of other Bible studies because he's sort of a disagreeable guy, mm-hmm. very fatalistic and Calvinist in his viewpoints, and likes to rant about it. And he's not happy about it. He basically, if I could sum up his attitude, the whole thing's rigged. God's predestined everything. I don't like it, but that's the way it is. And I don't believe any of you about this other nice stuff. And then I'm like, I asked him, I was like, well, why do you go to church? And he just straight ahead, just was like, fear. And I'm just like, I appreciate the honesty. But he's had a pretty wild life. I imagine. I think he, in his rants, he tells these stories about things he's experienced. Abused by his father. His father was abused even worse by his grandfather. His grandfather was abused even worse by his great grandfather. He never married or had kids. He ended up working in prisons and with handicapped kids that were, that in the schooling system. And so he just saw all these crazy things, and he wasn't there because he wanted to help people. He was there because he felt stuck. And basically, I think the whole thing traumatized him. And then he had an accident, probably had a brain injury that he had never got treatment. So he's like just a cantankerous old dude that's been through like all kinds mm-hmm. of stuff, short of going to Vietnam and, witnessing horrors or something. So, but he's not happy about life, really. But he keeps coming to church, and you can have a conversation with him, but he's a little bit kind of like, some people lose patience with him. But all right, all that to say, like, when he rants about his, let's just call it trauma for right now, when he trauma rants, people's reaction to him and my reaction towards him is the same as the friends. Like, oh, you don't understand God. You don't understand this. God wouldn't do that to you. God wouldn't do that.
Right.
Trying to justify these things. And I even watched myself as I was like, I wonder if he's covering up for like something horrible.
Yeah. There you go.
And I'm just like,
so this is the glory of the text, is that it's not as, and that's one of the simplistic ways that a short discussion of Job comes out, is that these guys are bad guys. The interlocutors are bad guys. Job's a good guy.
Yeah.
this is us. and and then Job, even to some degree, he's got this hard edge to him in places that it's like, I'm not sure I really do want to listen to this anymore. And in the end, it does, I think, have that progression, that progression towards the end where it's no longer, I think you're right. Job no longer is going to be lashing out like that. And so that's the evolution or the progression.
Yeah, well, even like you say that the friends are us, but even Job's us, because like I've listened to people talk about their own suffering in their life, like this guy, he basically says some of the same stuff that Job says, like almost word for word. And I went to him one week and I was telling him about this. I was like, what you're saying is pretty close to Job. Like, and I read him some part out of like chapter 6 or something. Yeah. Job was like ranting and he's like, couldn't agree with you more. Like,
and then that's where and that's where I can see, and you're emoting when you read it. I mean, and that's where I go back to the poetry of it, because then if you see that whole thing there and you don't have to have an answer for what the whole thing's about. I mean, we've got a picture here that we've talked about, but then you go back to reading even the interlocutors or Job, and there'll be these passages that really are just powerfully expressing just this stuff, just what you are living in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And it's like
at a deeper level.
Right.
Like,
and so
I've said some crazy stuff in my own suffering, but nothing as crazy as what Job said.
Right. And then you read it, it's like that's expressing that reality. And that's where it brings out the kind of the connection, the kind of communion that you can have with all of, the extent of human history. I mean, this narrative was, 30,000 years old or whatever it is.
Timothy Petitsis wrote this book called The Ethics of Beauty. Have you heard of it?
I've heard. In fact, it's one of the ones. And listening to you guys, I've got as my next thing to.
Yeah, it's a giant fat book, but he talks a lot about at the beginning of it about trauma and stuff, and sort of a beauty first approach to. It's his whole thing. But one thing he said in there that was really interesting was that he believes that the Iliad was written so that the survivors of the wars, like, is it the Trojan War?
Yep.
That it would actually help them heal, because the Iliad, I haven't read the Iliad, but this what I get from his description of it, or what he says about it, is like the Iliad doesn't sugarcoat anything, for one. Like, you have the berserker and the guy that goes crazy, and then the horrible atrocities that are committed and all this stuff, like everything goes wrong, and so he paints this picture of all the men coming together and reading through this over who knows how many days,
200, yeah,
and they would read it together and live through their experiences again, but through the Odyssey, where there's no judgment placed on it, like a certain way they have to feel, or a certain because they've experienced stuff, they've also done stuff. Peterson talks about, like, a lot of PTSD doesn't necessarily come from people doing stuff to you. You could actually do stuff like in war or something that can traumatize you because you didn't want to do that, or you didn't know that you were capable of it, and then now you have to live with some horrible thing. And so he thought that the book was to help people heal, like that's what it's for. And I have an inkling, I don't even know how to do this, but I think the book of Job is to help people heal from trauma, because and I think this gets to a different question, not what does the book say or what does it mean? It's what is the book for? And so I think I don't know how to do this, and I want to try it, but I think if you read it through with people, like, it's a healing book. At least I mean it's been deeply impactful in an integrating way for me that's helped like I haven't had a whole lot of traumatic things happen to me or anything, but it's been I feel stronger after reading it and going through it.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's the purpose of Job, because like we were just talking about, like, I am the friends, I am
right.
but I haven't said anything as crazy as the friends say.
Right. And you can stop it before it comes out of your mouth, and you can then move to that next that next approach. And I agree with you on that. Job gives
the perfect voice of the perspective of just being a person.
Yeah. What is an integrated person? Well, as Sherry keeps emphasizing about Job, is that at the center needs to be this integrity, this kind of center of integrity, which is a kind of honesty, a kind of pure honesty about things, which includes this sense that there's a tragic nature to our experience, and it's not his tragedy or a tragedy because of that faction doing something, or because if I could just be more some way, it wouldn't be there. Right. No, it's a tragedy that's at the center of everything. It's at the center of all of us. And that, in a certain sense, unifies us. It's a universal, and yeah.
Well, yeah. And like in the things that I've experienced, and to be able to, like, so some people get stuck because they're not honest, because they're not saying the things they need to say to God, and they're not demanding that God give them an answer like Job did. And so I think there's things in here that are like kind of, because Job ends up, like, God ends up saying like what Job said was right. And you go through there and you're like, well, this can't be like theologically or systematically right, because he says the
contradictory things in places.
Insane. Yeah. But he's got this deep honesty, integrity, like you just said, that you're like, okay, all I've got to do is be honest about how things appear to me. Even if I know it's not right, just be like, God, this is terrible, and I don't like you right now, or just like, that's like the bare minimum, because like you read, I mean, I think people get stuck, and if you read through Job, you can find ways in which Job goes even farther, and so you can be like, okay, I'm not so bad.
Yeah, so that's great. That's great. And let's see what I was gonna get at. Let's see, the wisdom poem. The center is going to be important. I mean, that was great. The video you did on that was excellent. I'm actually going to use it. My kids, my family has a kind of discussion group, and we choose something to talk about. And I don't know if you've seen the movie Oppenheimer.
No, not yet.
No. Anyway, well, it's obvious it's about like technology and the way technology, gets out of our control, and that we, move forward into the world without any wisdom, and I'm gonna cut your video. I'm gonna scrape it off so that at least at the beginning, when my family listens to it, they don't know it's Job.
Oh, nice.
And so, because it's so good, and it just matches up with that film so well, because it's the drive, the human drive to, kind of do all the stuff that's in the first part of the poem, and then, where's wisdom, and that's what that film, and I think in a way is about. And so that'll be our discussion in a week or two, hopefully.
You have to let me know how that goes.
Yeah, yeah. So that's going to be, hopefully that'll work out. My kids like doing this stuff. We have good conversations about it. So
yeah, you said you watch with Karen. You said you watch a bunch of movies and have discussions about them. And
yeah, I do like that stuff.
How do you arrange that? Like, because my boys they're teenagers now, and so I'm trying to like engage in stuff like that more.
Yeah, I don't know. It's my kids are older now. They're in their 20s and early 30s even, and so they're adults. So we've all gotten through the time when it would be, we got to choose what to watch and what not to watch. I don't know if that was what you were getting at, but
Well, it's just like trying to sit down and like talk about some of this stuff because like and just like sometimes they're just like so they're just not interested
in
something, and I'll try to bring up something else. I'm like, what's
Yeah, I don't know. Since the way it happened for me was that my son, who's the youngest, had an impulse that's very much like me in terms of kind of learning and talking and writing. He journals and he investigates different kind of things. And as he was a late teenager, he started thinking about all this kind of stuff, and we started conversations about that, and it kind of led from there. And then that kind of infected the rest of the family in a way.
Yeah.
The rest of the family isn't as obsessive with it as Kevin and I are, but Kevin's a poet, and he, I'd throw out, maybe I'll send you some, he's got a band. He has a band, and he wrote the poetry for the band. And there's a lot of, I think, good stuff in there. And so he's very thoughtful that way. So we have a lot of, and that band became kind of, there's a little fandom around here for the band. And so my daughters and my wife and everybody were all into the band.
What kind of music did they play?
Huh?
What kind of music?
Well, it's in the end they're a Christian group, if you will, but it's not really focused as Christian. Let me see if I can bring up a way of searching on Spotify for the band's name is The Slow.
The Slow? I'll have to look them up.
And let me see if I can give you a search that will.
Because there's a band called Slow, but that's not that. Are you from Idaho?
Yeah.
I grew up in Moscow.
Oh, did you? Wow.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's see.
Then lived in Riggins for. Do you know where Riggins is?
Oh yeah. I've gone over there. Fishing over there.
Oh, salmon fishing?
Yeah. Let's see. Here's one. Let me see if I can copy the link. I'll send it to you in email.
All right.
Anyway, that's great. Let's see. What else? Would there be anything else you want to touch on?
I got to go here in a few minutes, but I did want to ask you about T.S. Eliot. So I don't know anything about T.S. Eliot, but I heard that you have a love for him. And then you mentioned just a love for poetry in general. And so I like searched on YouTube, and I like brought up the 4 quartets, and I listened to I think the first one. And this is how it normally is for me. Like poetry doesn't I have to be initiated somehow. Like someone has to tell me why something is important before that was how it was with George MacDonald. Like someone showed me some stuff from George MacDonald. I read Fantastes, and I was like, I don't understand what's going on. And then Sherry sort of was like, don't you see this and this and this and this? And I was like,
yeah, I'd love to be the one who could initiate you into it. For me, it goes way, way back to when I was, before I was 20, I started reading 4 quartets. I didn't know what I was reading, but for whatever reason, that kind of philosophical kind of way in which you see the first number of lines in that just attracted me. And I just decided I needed to try to figure this out. And I didn't until much later. But it always has stayed with me for my entire life, in fact. And I'm hoping to do even more with it. Ted, he may have mentioned he's hoping to do a conference on Christian poetry, and I'm hoping to talk at that conference.
Oh, nice.
But I would, like you and Sherry, to some degree, it would take a big, elaborate kind of thing. If you read, there's some more overtly Christian parts of it. If you read the last 2 quartets, Dry Salvages and Little Gidding, there's a little bit more where you can see the Dry Salvages has this chaos, this ocean theme in it a little bit. So there's a little chaos stuff in it. And then in the Little Gidding, there's a gesture to Mariology. There's a figure in there who's Mary praying over the world, and so that might give you a hook. But it's involved, and it's just involved like Job is for you, and there's a whole thing about T.S. Eliot, in a way, he was living in a world kind of like C.S. Lewis, in that he came from a place that was World War I time and very kind of modernist and without regret, let's say, or maybe with regret at the loss of Christianity from the culture. That was the presumptive way of being an intellectual at the time. And then he moved back towards Christianity through his life, and the Four Quartets is really the kind of apotheosis of that, coming back to Christianity. And he's also this guy like C.S. Lewis or Tolkien who knows the kind of the entire sweep of Western literature, going all the way back to the beginning and including, everything, because he was a philologist and a classicist and all that stuff. So a lot of this intertextuality, he refers to Dante a lot. And so this would actually, Dante would probably be have you ever read The Divine Comedy?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, that would be one to think about, because it's big. That's the problem with it. It's kind of big, but it's got the same poetic feeling, I think, that Job does in a way. And
really?
I think you can get into it quicker, maybe. I don't know.
Right.
Maybe we talk again about T.S. Eliot. I'll try to think about how I might help you with that.
All right. I'll try. I'll listen to the last two and I'll see.
He's got some overtly Christian poems just before Four Quartets as well. Ash Wednesday, and there's a nativity one, I think Christmas Eve or something. I can't remember the name of it. So that you can look those up as well.
All right.
I'll send you Kevin's music and see what you think.
All right.
Hey, Jess.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jim. It was awesome talking with you. We should do it.
It was good fun. I'm glad to now meet you directly.
I know. Glad to meet you too.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Yeah, we're so far gone that we built our homes outside the present tense. Call me hippie, call me Christian, you can call me mystic, but in the end, I'm just a slow kid. 'Cause the world, it has its message, but I guess I missed it, singing along to the waves and the wind. You can call it meditation, you can call it music, but in the end, it's just the way that it is. This isn't just another moment, it's the only time that there'll ever be for us to live.